The 12 board members and the state inspector sat in complete silence. Every eye in the room locked onto me. My CEO stood at the head of the table, his face red, his finger pointing at the stack of documents in front of me. He had just given me an ultimatum in front of everyone. Sign the certification. Confirm that the materials met federal standards. Shake my son-in-law's hand and apologize for the disruption I had caused. Do it right now. Or clean out my desk before noon. I had spent 22 years earning the reputation I carried into that room. 22 years of early mornings, of getting my hands dirty on job sites when the temperature dropped below freezing, of being the person that other engineers called when something didn't add up. I had started as a welder's assistant straight out of the Navy, worked my way through every certification the industry offered, and built a career on one simple principle. If my name goes on a document, what's in that document is true. My CEO knew that. He had known it when he hired me 11 years ago. He was counting on it now, counting on the fact that I valued my career enough to protect his. I looked at the documents in front of me. Then I looked at the briefcase under my chair. I said, before I sign anything, I'd like to share something with the room. What happened in the 3 months leading up to that moment started, like most disasters do, quietly. Hargrove Construction had held the state contract for the Route 9 bridge expansion for 4 years. It was the kind of project that defined a company, a $240 million rehabilitation of a critical arterial bridge that carried over 80,000 vehicles daily, including school buses, emergency vehicles, and commercial freight. My role as chief structural inspector meant that nothing moved forward without my sign-off. Every steel shipment, every concrete pour, every weld certification passed through my desk. I had done this job long enough to know that every project has a moment of maximum pressure. The money gets tight, the schedule slips, and someone in a suit starts making decisions that belong to engineers. I had navigated those moments before. I knew how to hold the line without burning down relationships. What I had not navigated before was my son-in-law. My CEO's son-in-law had joined the company 8 months earlier. He had an MBA from a school with a good name, a LinkedIn profile full of buzzwords, and the absolute confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything because nobody had ever been willing to tell him he was. He was 32 years old, and he had been appointed project director of the Route 9 expansion over 3 other candidates who had spent their careers preparing for exactly that role. I did not dislike him because of how he got the position. I had worked for companies my whole life where who you knew mattered as much as what you knew. That was the reality of the industry. What I disliked was what he did with the position once he had it. From his first week on the project, my son-in-law made clear that his primary metric was cost, not safety ratings, not engineering tolerances, not the kind of long-term durability standards that determined whether a bridge lasted 30 years or 60. Cost. He had a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet had a target. Everything else was a variable. He started with small things, pushing back on inspection timelines, questioning why certain testing procedures were required when the supplier had already provided documentation, asking me to explain, in plain English, why we couldn't simply accept the manufacturer's certification instead of running our own independent verification. I explained every time. Patiently at first, because I understood he was new to the technical side. Manufacturer certifications told you what a product was supposed to be. Independent verification told you what it actually was. For structural steel, on a bridge carrying 80,000 vehicles a day, the difference between those two things was not a line item. It was the reason bridge inspectors existed. He nodded. He thanked me for the explanation. The following week, he asked the same question again from a different angle. By the 3rd month, I had begun keeping records of every conversation. I want to be honest about why I did that. It was not because I suspected fraud at that point. It was because I had dealt with enough difficult project directors to know that when things went wrong, and in construction, things always went wrong somewhere. The person who had raised objections without documentation was the person who absorbed the blame. I was protecting myself. That was all. Then the October shipment arrived. The steel beams for the main span replacement were the most critical structural component of the entire project. The specifications called for a 992 grade steel, with a minimum yield strength of 50 ksi and specific toughness ratings required for the temperature range our region experienced. We had been through 3 previous shipments without issue. The supplier was a company my son-in-law had switched us to in month 2, over my written objection, because their bid came in 11% lower than our previous supplier. When the October shipment came in, something felt wrong before I even ran the numbers. The mill certificates looked right. The markings on the beams looked right, but the surface texture was inconsistent in a way I had seen before, years ago, on a project in Ohio, where a subcontracting supplier had been caught substituting lower-grade material and falsifying the accompanying documentation. I pulled 4 beam samples and sent them to an independent metallurgical laboratory 3 states away. I paid for the testing out of my own pocket. I did not tell anyone I had done it. I did not hear back from the lab for 11 days. In that time, the project continued. My son-in-law accelerated the installation schedule. I raised a procedural hold on 3 beam placements, citing standard verification protocol, which gave me the window I needed without triggering a formal escalation. The lab report came back on a Tuesday night. I read it twice, sitting in my truck in the parking lot of a diner off the interstate. The beams were a 36 grade steel. The yield strength was 36 KSI, 14 points below specification. At the loading conditions our bridge would regularly experience, the margin of safety was not just reduced. In certain thermal contraction scenarios during a hard winter, it was essentially gone. Someone had taken a 36 steel, applied false mill markings, and submitted fraudulent documentation, certifying it as A992. I sat in that truck for a long time. I thought about my 22 years. I thought about my mortgage. I thought about the fact that I did not yet know how high up this went, which meant I did not yet know who I could trust inside the company. Then I thought about what 80,000 vehicles a day meant. I thought about the school buses. I drove home, sat at my kitchen table, and called the only person outside the company I trusted completely. His name was Ray, and he had spent 30 years as a senior structural engineer for the state DOT before retiring. We had known each other since I was an apprentice. He listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "You need to talk to someone at the state infrastructure office before you do anything else inside that company." I said I didn't want to go around my employer without at least giving them a chance to address it internally. He said, "Daniel, if this is what you're describing, there is no internal path that doesn't run through the person who may already know about it. You go internal first. You give them time to destroy the evidence and make you the story." I asked him if he knew anyone at the state office. He said he knew someone at the regional inspector general's office who handled contractor fraud. He said he would make a call. 2 days later, I was sitting across from a woman named Carla, who had the quiet, careful manner of someone who had heard a lot of stories and was very good at separating the ones that mattered from the ones that didn't. I brought the lab report, copies of the original specifications, the mill certificates from the October shipment, and the written objection I had filed when my son-in-law switched suppliers. I also brought printed copies of every email exchange I had saved over the previous 3 months. Carla read through everything slowly. She asked precise, specific questions. She did not tell me what her office was going to do or on what timeline. She told me to continue doing my job exactly as I normally would, to document everything, and not to discuss this conversation with anyone at Hargrove. She also told me that if my employer attempted to compel me to certify materials I believed to be non-compliant, I should contact her immediately and should not sign anything. I drove back to the job site and went back to work. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of my career. I was sitting on information that I could not act on directly, working alongside people I could not read, trying to behave exactly as I always had, while knowing that something very serious was moving forward somewhere outside my field of vision. My son-in-law was pushing hard to close out the October installation. I continued to hold the procedural verification open, citing paperwork backlogs, which bought time but was starting to draw attention. The night before, what was supposed to be my sign-off deadline, I was working late in the site trailer going through documentation when I heard my son-in-law's voice outside. He was on the phone. The trailer window was cracked open for ventilation. I was not trying to listen. I listened anyway. He was talking to someone about the inspection. He said the old man was being difficult. He said they needed the certification on paper before the state compliance review on the 15th or the whole payment schedule was at risk. He said he had already talked to his father-in-law and that the situation was going to be handled. He said, one way or another, that signature is getting on those documents this week. I sat very still for a moment. Then I took out my phone and started recording. He talked for another 4 minutes. He was not careful. He was frustrated, and he was speaking to someone he trusted, and he said things that no one running a legitimate operation would ever say out loud. He referenced the supplier by name. He referenced the material substitution as something he had known about, not discovered. He said the markup on the cost savings had already been split, and that there was no going back now, only forward. When he hung up and walked away, I sat there with my phone in my hand and understood that what I had was no longer a materials compliance issue. It was a criminal conspiracy. And my son-in-law had just handed me the evidence to prove it. I called Carla that night at 9:30. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had recorded. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me to preserve the audio, email it to the address she gave me immediately, and come to her office at 7 the following morning. I did not sleep that night. What I did do was go through every document. I had access to every email, every shipment record, every payment authorization, and organize it into a single folder on a flash drive. I printed hard copies of the most critical items. I wrote a clear, detailed summary of the timeline, from the supplier switch to the current date, with specific document references for every claim. At 7 the next morning, I sat across from Carla and two people I had not met before, who identified themselves as investigators. They asked questions for 2 hours. When we were done, one of the investigators told me that my employer would likely schedule a meeting with me very soon, and that it was important I attend and behave normally. He said, "Whatever they ask you to do in that meeting, call us before you do it." The meeting happened the next afternoon. My CEO called me into the main conference room. His son-in-law was there. The company's legal counsel was there. And, because the state compliance review was in 2 days and nothing could proceed without the structural certifications, the state's regional infrastructure inspector was also present, invited by my CEO, I assumed, to add pressure. My CEO did not waste time. He said there had been some confusion around the October materials certification, and he wanted to resolve it today. He said the documentation was in order, and he needed my signature on the certification package before end of business. He said my son-in-law had reviewed everything thoroughly and was prepared to vouch for the materials. I said I had some concerns about the October shipment that I had not been able to resolve through standard verification. My CEO's voice changed. He said he was aware of the concerns and he was telling me they had been addressed. I said I had sent samples to an independent lab. The room got very quiet. My son-in-law said that kind of unilateral action was outside my job scope and that he would be taking that up with HR. My CEO looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, that I had a choice in front of me. I could sign the certification, acknowledge that the delay had been a misunderstanding, and move forward with my career intact. Or I could continue down a path that would end with my termination for insubordination and a very difficult professional reference. He said, "I've built this company for 30 years. My son-in-law is family. You are an employee. I think you understand what I'm telling you." I understood exactly what he was telling me. I reached under my chair and picked up my briefcase. I set it on the table and opened it. I took out the lab report, the printed timeline with document references, and the flash drive. I placed them in front of the state inspector, who had been sitting very still and very quietly through the entire exchange. I said, before anyone else says anything, "I need the inspector to look at what's in front of her." My CEO started to speak. The door to the conference room opened. Carla walked in, with two people behind her I recognized from the morning meeting, along with 2 state police officers and a third individual who showed my CEO a federal identification credential. The room stopped. My CEO turned to look at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was something older than anger. It was the look of a man who understood that the thing he had spent 30 years building had just become something he would spend the rest of his time explaining. His son-in-law stood up. One of the officers put a hand on his shoulder and asked him to sit back down. The investigation that followed took 7 months. The federal contractor fraud statute, combined with the falsified documentation, the recorded phone call, and the financial records that the investigators pulled from both the supplier and Hargrove's accounts, produced a case that the U.S. Attorney's Office described as one of the more straightforward they had handled in recent years. My son-in-law's call had been reckless, in a way that made the investigators' job significantly easier. The supplier's cooperation, once it became clear that the alternative was bearing the full weight of the charges alone, filled in the remaining gaps. My CEO was indicted on 4 counts, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud and submitting false certification to a government contractor. His son-in-law faced 6 counts. The supplier's ownership faced federal charges in a separate jurisdiction. The Route 9 bridge project was halted pending a full independent structural review. Every beam from the October shipment was removed and replaced. The project was delayed 14 months, and the cost overrun, ironically, was nearly 3 times the amount that had been saved by switching suppliers. I want to be honest about the aftermath, because the honest version is more complicated than the clean version. I did not stay at Hargrove. The company survived under new ownership and new management, and the new leadership made genuine efforts to rebuild credibly. But I had spent 11 years there, and the version of that place I had known was gone. Some of my colleagues struggled to separate what I had done from the disruption it caused to their livelihoods. I understood that. I did not blame them for it. What I did was take 6 months, consult with the labor attorney who had advised me throughout the process, and then take a position as a senior structural reviewer with the State Infrastructure Office. It was a pay cut. It came with the kind of bureaucratic friction that anyone who has worked in government will recognize immediately. And it was, without question, the right move. Ray called me the week I started the new job. He asked how it felt. I told him it felt like being able to go to work in the morning without carrying something I couldn't put down. He said that was as good a definition of the right decision as he'd ever heard. There is a comment I read once under a video similar to this one. Someone wrote that whistleblowers rarely win, that it takes luck, and that without the right connections at the right moment, the outcome flips. I have thought about that comment more than once. It is not entirely wrong. I had Ray, who knew Carla, who had the authority and the will to move quickly. Without that, the timeline changes. With a different inspector in that room, the dynamic in that meeting changes. Luck is not nothing, but I had also spent 3 months documenting every conversation. I had paid out of pocket for independent lab testing before I had any reason to believe I would need it. I had not confronted my son-in-law directly or given him any indication that I knew what I knew. I had not gone to HR, where the information would have reached my CEO within the hour. I had not signed anything to buy myself time. Every decision I made from the moment I read that lab report was a decision made with the understanding that I might be the only person in a position to stop something genuinely dangerous, and that the only tool I had that could not be taken away from me was the fact that I had done my job correctly and kept the records to prove it. Luck matters. Preparation matters more. 80,000 vehicles cross that bridge every day. The school buses run their routes in the morning and the afternoon, and the long weeks of January, when the temperature drops below zero, and structural steel contracts, and the tolerances that engineers spend their careers calculating become the difference between a normal Tuesday and something no one forgets. I think about that sometimes when I'm driving to work in the morning, not with fear, with the particular kind of steadiness that comes from knowing that when the moment arrived, I did not flinch from it. That is, in the end, the only thing I have ever wanted to be able to say about the way I did this job. My name is on the documents I sign. Everything in them is true.